Put a sign underneath, said you can also hang coats and hats on these. Being of a very sweet disposition, the angel is put in charge of these flowers that you see. He was a little slow in getting them out today. The floor manager said to him, "Better put those flowers out or I'll spank you." The angel says, "That's a big joke. An angel doesn't have any place to spank." Well, this is a telecast on hope. And the reason we've chosen this subject is because there seems to be so much despair in the world. And we will take as despairing a look as one can and then extract hope. You remember the old legend of Pandora's box? Pandora opened a box, and death, disease, destruction, economic chaos, leprosy, fears all came out. And she barely slammed the lid on the box. Otherwise, hope would have got out. Hope was the only thing that was left in the box, to indicate that there's some hope even amidst all the evils of the world. G.F. Watts did a painting of hope. And in it, he pictured a beautiful lady, but blindfolded, seated on a solitary planet whirling around into space. And she had before a harp. But the harp had only one string. And she was drawing a melody out of that one string. That is hope. Now, because we're going to show the real basis of hope, let us picture what the world thinks of despair, and we're going to give the three wombs and origins of modern despair. And I will perhaps leave these on the board and then come back to them every now and then. In other words, what makes modern despair? Well, first thing is God is dead. In other words, we have nothing left in this world except the world itself. If there's any hope, it's technology and science. Maybe if we just give enough time, technology may be able to take care of all of our diseases. There'll be no more poverty. But there's no such thing as guilt or sin. We have only to deal with social issues. This is one of the despairing pictures of the modern world. And the second is violence, which disturbs us all. Now, out of all of the many facets of violence that we could choose, we're just going to choose one phase of violence, and that will be modern wars. Now, what is terrible about modern wars is that they involve less and less the soldiers who fight. They touch more and more the civilians. And let me run down a picture. In World War I, there were 10 million killed. Out of that 10 million, the amount of civilians was only 5%, which was indeed small. In World War II, there were 50 million killed. And the number of civilians was 48% non-combatants. The Korean War, there were 9 million killed, and the amount of civilians, 84%. We could go on to robberies, muggings, murders, and so forth. But this shows that civilians and non-combatants are less and less immune from violence and destruction. A third basis of insecurity, of rather despair in our modern world, is what might be called the despair that comes from the secular city. The anxiety of modern man in contemporary civilization, his fears, his dreads, his neuroses, his psychoses, his loneliness. He's a wanderer on the earth. And you add up these three. Of a world in which science is the only hope and there is no guilt, violence and secularism, you have the despair in which we're all involved. Now, there have been myths in history which rather typify these three, and I'm going now to go to myths. We make perhaps too much fun of myths, but they, under the guise of a story or a legend or a novel that depicts the mind of history, there is hidden a great truth. One myth we go to, which belongs in this category here, is the myth of Faust. In this story of Faust the devil, he starts translating the Gospel of John. The beginning of the Gospel of John is, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was purpose, goal, meaning, destiny, intelligence. And the devil translated, in the beginning was the, and he could not write word. That was too much for him. He couldn't give intelligence to anybody but himself. And so Faust wrote, in the beginning was the deed. In the beginning is the act. In the beginning is the situation. In the beginning is the thing that you do, which is without any moral determinant. That's merely the old way of picturing this notion. Now we come to another myth. The myth of Prometheus. Prometheus stole fire from heaven. When he brought fire down to this earth, he brought with it violence and destructiveness, not warmth and not love. And this old ancient Greek myth is passed on through all of the ages. And then we come to a third myth, Circe. Circe had a magic wand. The magic wand was stolen, and anyone that it touched turned into a pig. For Circe had that power. In other words, evil is lonely when it's left by itself. It has to have company. It's got to form a city, corporation, a group. Circe was the basis of all evil communications, whatever they be. Press, radio, television, pornography, anything. That which is wicked and base wants to make everyone else base, otherwise it's not content and happy. So you see, there's nothing new. Despair is only happening to new people. Now we're going to use one other example, and that will be the burden of this telecast. We're going to use the example of Cain, the Cain who killed Abel. And that's the beginning of all of these legends and of the despair of the contemporary civilization. First, Cain was the one who said, practically, God is dead. Why? He refused to acknowledge guilt. No guilt, we said. No judge. And that was one of the reasons why Cain would offer no bloody sacrifice. He offered what? He offered nature. He offered technology. He offered the earth. He would not admit that he was responsible to anyone else. There was foulness on his soul that had to be washed away. It was only the manipulation of things, that was all. That's the reason the sacrifice was not pleasing. Secondly, violence. He was the man with a club. Just as soon as God is dead, neighbor's dead. It follows. And so the day that Cain raised that forked club over the head of Abel and let it fall upon him, it turned into a gun, turned into hydrogen, turned into nitrogen, turned into intercontinental missiles. And the violence has continued from that club of Cain up to the present time. There was a German writer by the name of Brochert who wrote a story about Cain without mentioning Abel, for after all, we all belong to the race of Cain. And he said, when he was 2, at the age of 2, 2 men fought with fists. At the age of 12, they fought with clubs. At the age of 22, they fought with guns. At the age of 42, they were both infected with disease. And at the age of 62, they died and were buried together. And finally, when Cain had killed his brother, he said, I'll be a wanderer on the earth. He was frightened and afraid. And when God said to him, where's your brother Abel? He said, wherever I go, men will kill me. He was afraid of vengeance. And so he founded the first city. Interesting, isn't it? What he dreaded was some kind of wrath that might be upon him. Now it's strange, isn't it, that in a talk on hope I should picture despair in such a triple way? Why? Oh, because we don't want hope to be just a kind of an optimism, a blinking of ourselves to the great realities of life. We're going to take the worst, when evil is most potent, and show how there's hope. And who will show us? Cain. So let's go back to Cain. That's going to give the angel a big job to get rid of all of that violence and despair. He loves to get rid of despair. Just watch him work on that board. But listen to what I'm saying, too. You in the television audience won't see him, but I can only tell you that he doesn't like hopelessness. Now we come to hope and Cain. When Cain had killed his brother, he said to God, "Wherever I go, men will seek to kill me." See, there were other men besides Cain on earth. And he became a wanderer upon the earth. Anxiety, restlessness in this secular city. He went off to the land of Nod. The word Nod is from the Hebrew word Nod, which means wanderer, that's all. He became restless like modern man. And when he said to God, "I'm afraid," what did God say? He said, "I will set a mark upon you, that no one may take vengeance upon you." What was that mark? Was it for any of the successors of Cain? Not very likely. What was the mark itself? I don't know, it might have been the blood that was on his hands, Abel's blood that he couldn't wash off. Could have been that. Blood like that which stained the hands of Lady Macbeth, who said, "Will not all the waters of the seven seas wash this blood incarnadine from my hands?" But at any rate, he was given a sign. You see, the sign was not vengeance, it was to protect him from vengeance. God was giving him a sign like that rainbow in the sky after the flood. A covenant of mercy. In other words, Cain, you'll not be revenged. Vengeance belongs to me, not to men. So he surrounded him with what? Surrounded him with mercy. Very much like, for example, the judges in the Middle Ages, whenever they sentenced anyone to death, had to receive communion with that man the day of his death, in order to remind them, the condemned man, that after all, though I'm executing justice, you belong to a greater realm of mercy and understanding and compassion. And so what God did was surround him with compassion, with mercy. And that mark was a sign, you're God's property. You don't belong to men so that they can kill you. You're mine. And the Arabic word Gainel means slave of God, which is probably a word that was taken from this very mark of Cain. Now let's modernize Cain and the murder of Abel. And let us go to a modern Cain and a modern Abel. To the assassination of Martin Luther King. He's slain by another. There's a trial. In the course of the trial, evidence is adduced against Cain, the assassin. Prosecuting attorney points out that exactly the same fingerprints that are found on a gun were found on objects which he left in a room. Witnesses come forward, and she said, "I don't know why he is insecure. Everyone else in the neighborhood is." Which brings up the question, are we more neurotic on these days? Now, there are two answers. We're going to consider both. One answer is, well, we are not more neurotic. There have always been both psychotics and neurotics. Take, for example, very famous people have done queer things. The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, for example, had a passion for building paper boats. He would float them in the bathtub. And one day he didn't have any paper, and he made a boat out of a 50-pound bill. Spinoza, the philosopher. You know what he was fond of doing? He was fond of catching spiders and matching them one against another and watching them fight. Petavius used to get up from his chair at the end of every second hour of work and spin it around 10 times, then sit down and work for another 2 hours. But those who hold that we are not more neurotic today than before use such arguments as these. First of all, in 1853, there was a work, just think, 1853, a work published, The Great Disease of Our Times, Neuroses, work by Weinecke. The University of Tübingen in Germany made a study of neuroses and came to the conclusion that we are not more neurotic. It is only the symptoms that have changed. Now suppose we take this position and analyze it. Have the symptoms of neuroses changed? But as far as quantity is concerned, there are no more neuroses. It is possible. What was the great difference between the old neuroses, previous days, and our very modern ones? The difference was this, that in all the years I've been on television, for example, I've never found a neurotic angel. They're always normal. And my present angel, named after an Old Testament character, Eli, is just about as normal as blueberry pie. Well, here's the difference between the old neuroses and the new, indicating a change of symptoms. The old neuroses were of the moral order. That is to say, people became neurotic because they became disordered in their relationship either to God, to their neighbor, or to themselves. That, for example, was the problem with the prodigal son. See, he broke this threefold bond. He left the father's house. He became alienated from neighbor because he cleaved to a citizen of the foreign country and became a feeder of swine. And then finally, he was alienated from himself because when he finally did return, it was because he entered into himself. So in these days, men became neurotic because of a sense of guilt. They broke a bond with love. And that's the right understanding of guilt, normal guilt. Hurting someone that you love. That's the meaning of a crucifix. There's the picture of someone I love. Now these were the old symptoms. What are the new symptoms? The new symptoms are either fiscal or physical. That is to say, people today become neurotic not because they break a relationship with divine love and with neighbor and with themselves. They become neurotic either on account of money or on account of health. Think of how many people today have neuroses simply because they've lost money, they're afraid of losing it, or they're not able to keep up with the Joneses. The history of America could be written in terms of money, our recessions, our depressions, and our panics. Recession is where you tighten your belt. A depression is where you have no belt. And a panic is where you have no pants. So modern neuroses are born of money. And also fear of losing health. You see, the great dread that anyone has that produces a neurosis all depends upon what they fear losing. Here it was relationship with love. Here one of these two. Just think of the commercials, for example. Think of how neurotic we're becoming. When, for example, here is a boy who, a young man whose hair is a bit unruly. He can't find a girl. And suddenly, out of nowhere comes a faceless man who hands him a tube. He gets his oil changed. He puts it on his hair. Glory be to God, there are about 20 girls around all of a sudden. You know, you just think of a man going crazy because he lacks oil in his hair. And then bad breath. Oh. The neuroses that are induced. There are meetings in offices. Will we tell Mary? Shall we tell John? I don't think I've got the courage to tell him. And then they meet even, goodness gracious, even football players. Great big men, you'd think they shouldn't worry about bad breath. Here they all meet you. I wonder if we should tell our coach. These big cowards weighing 300 pounds, I'm afraid to tell him he's got bad breath. And the man with bad breath comes in, he's got a bottle of hope in his hand. He's healthy, he's not neurotic. And then hands, oh. Poor wife who's lost the love of the husband. He touched her hand last night, it was scaly. She calls in the neighbors. She's losing her husband's love, scaly hands. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there comes a bottle. What does she do now to cure herself? What's the cure of this neurosis? Wash dishes. She puts a few drops of this magic fluid in the dishes, and lo and behold, her husband and the wife are reunited. Why do we have to have divorces in the United States when all we could do is get new soap? Well, that's the difference between the old and new neuroses. And so this is the answer to one question. Namely, are we more neurotic? Many say, no, we are not, only the symptoms have changed. Now, that could very well be. But let's take the other position. Then you can decide for yourselves when we've given both arguments. The other argument is that we are much more neurotic on account of an entirely different philosophy of life. Now, this philosophy of life is not often expressed. It's just hidden in what you read and what many young people do. But I'm going to write out the two propositions of this philosophy of life. The first proposition is every experience is valid. That's the first proposition. Namely, anything that gives pleasure is right. You're never concerned about what anyone outside of that experience thinks. Society, moral order, parents. No. Experience of pleasure is judged of and by itself. Hence, get all the kicks you can out of life. It's the kick that matters, Nothing else. Breaking school windows, all right, you get a kick out of it. Well, are there any differences between experiences of pleasure? Yes, there are, and that brings us to the second principle. And the second principle is the more intense the pleasure or the experience, the more it is valid. For example, drugs, speeding. One is not going anywhere, but the faster you drive, the greater is your pleasure. And hence one looks for a new and deeper kind of experience, whatever it may happen to be. Now, are these principles valid? They're not. They're producing a tremendous amount of neurotics. Did you know, for example, that 25% of the clinical cases in psychiatric hospitals in the United States are cases of adolescents? Adolescents who have started with this philosophy. Now, let us judge it. What does it mean when we say that every experience is valid of and by itself? It means that there is not to be an object to judge the experience. Now, normally we have, in making any judgment, we have what? We have a subject, we have an object, and we have the relationship between the two, which is the judgment. For example, suppose I say that this blackboard here is 3.5 feet tall. I, the subject, make a judgment, and I have an experience of height. But how do I judge it? I judge it by an object. All of our experiences as rational beings are to be determined by objects. For example, now, I have a clock up there on top of the camera. The clock says I have 10 minutes yet to talk. Well, I can't simply say, well, I've got 15 minutes to talk and pay no attention to the clock. My experience of talking to you is judged by that object. Space is measured by it. This is one of the reasons this dropping of the object is incidentally the essence of decadence. Any civilization begins to decay when the subject alone is all important. The great I. Well, I decide it's right. I decide it's good. Therefore it is. Modern painting is often without an object. You can't tell whether it's a drunken man going up stairs or stairs going up a drunken man. Now, for example, just 3 weeks ago in the White House, they discovered a painting hanging upside down. Imagine in the White House. How did they know it was upside down? By the signature. But listen, that needn't be the telltale, because maybe the artist subjectively said, listen, I feel better painting this on my head. Look at the twisted ironworks that we have on Park Avenue. Some of our entrances to buildings. They tell absolutely nothing. This is a world of subjects. You can get out of it anything that you please. So our civilization decays when we drop standards, goals, objects, purposes, and destinies. And that's what we Americans have to watch. And is it always the intensity of the experience that makes it all the more valid? When, for example, this mother in one of our western states cut up her baby with broken bottles, was she justified in it? It was an intense experience. Was Madame Koch of Germany, who made lampshades out of the skin of the Jews that were thrown into furnaces? Was that right or was it wrong? And if you say that you may judge without an object or without a standard, then how will you ever condemn Hitler? Boy mugs an old woman 84 years old. You got a kick out of it. Is that the standard? Is that the judgment? Suppose a waitress brings in a couple of eggs to these people who hold that experience alone is valid. One of the eggs is good, the other is bad. Why does he say that egg is bad? If he says the egg is bad, he's judging by the standard outside of himself, by the object. Why did he order eggs in the first place? And the waitress might say to him, if he was judging everything subjectively, well, if it tastes bad to you, hand it over to him because he's got a good taste. I remember once I went into a restaurant and I asked for some toast, a cup of coffee, an egg, and a few kind words. And the waiter brought me back toast, coffee, the egg, and the check. I said, haven't you got a few kind words? She said, don't eat the egg. So, there are those, therefore, that would also hold that neuroses are increasing, and I believe that. And I believe it on account of this false philosophy which is taking over our nation. That every experience of every individual is right, without any relation to a goal or a purpose. If you want a real good philosophy along these lines, read Viktor, V-I-K-T-O-R, Viktor Frankl. F-R-A-N-K-L, a Jewish psychiatrist of the University of Vienna, who has given us psychology called logotherapy, L-O-G-O, T-H-E-R-A-P-Y. Anything of his is worth reading. Man who went through concentration camps, suffered under the Nazis, suffered under the communists. And he came out of it all saying that he survived simply because he realized that life had a meaning. He told me not very long ago, when I had dinner with him, that when the Nazis began their persecution, he had an opportunity to come to the United States to start his new school of psychology and psychiatry, logotherapy. He wanted to do it. He had the passport, but his father was living. And he was sure that the Nazis would begin an intense persecution. Dr. Frankl said he went to the Church of St. Stephen's in Vienna, knelt down for an hour. He prayed for wisdom. What should he do? Should he go to America? Or should he stay with his father? Watch his father maybe undergo the Nazi persecution and watch himself go through it as well. He came back to the house without a clear answer, but as as he sat down to table with his father, he said to his father, "What is that over there on that other table?" The father said, "A piece of marble. I picked it up today at the synagogue." Remember? Remember the synagogue that Hitler burned? Our synagogue? Well, I went over there and I rummaged among the dust and the ashes and the burnt embers, and I found this broken piece of marble. Viktor Frankl said to his father, "Did you ever try to figure out what it was?" "No," he said, "I haven't." Well, he said, "Let's look at it." It was in Hebrew. First three letters of one of the commandments. The fourth, "Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother." That was the answer Viktor Frankl wanted, and that night he had a dream. In that